Evil is typically known as immoral actions and thoughts. If one is evil, then their thoughts and or actions must either be wicked or immoral. However, evil has another attribute, its power to corrupt and lead one to death and disgrace, making a human unable to reach their full potential and instead becomes a burden that eventually crushes anyone who bears it. This series on the 3 moving evils of Kengan Omega will be looking at this very cycle and how it plays out with the King of Hades, Edward Wu. But before we get into that, don't forget to like and sub. This is the second part in the Moving Evil series, looking at Edward Wu, of course. So I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, let's begin. One of the most important characteristics of Edward Wu is his incredible self-confidence. In the infamous Kengan Ashura page, Evil is on the Move, we get to see Faye, G, and Edward. This panel perfectly foreshadows their character, as Faye's lack of identity and Edward's overconfidence is displayed perfectly in that page. Edward Wu is confident and cool-headed in almost every scene he is in, constantly smirking and thinking highly of himself. However, this confidence comes from Edward genuinely thinking he is above others, and we see this when he talks to the Kure and Wu clan, saying, "You're really old-fashioned, you really haven't gotten past that level yet." Edward genuinely thinks he is one of the greatest Wu clan members in existence, and so we see him constantly look down on other people most of the time. Another character that is similar to Edward is Ryan. In fact, both characters seem to be parodies of each other. Ryan also thinks highly of himself and looks down on others, but Ryan is a lot more aggressive and seems to have less control over that aggression. On the other hand, Edward is seemingly mature and keeps his cool almost constantly. This difference between Edward and Ryan can be accounted for by the Hengshang technique that was likely performed on Edward, and so he is not just one individual, but the amalgamation that is Wu Hei. However, it's important to note that even though Edward has a strong personality, and even when his clone, Gilbert Wu, showed grand ambitions of being a ruler, that Edward ultimately followed the connector. We know this by the fact that Edward himself said that the spirit of Wu Hei doesn't like following more than one person, as well as the fact that Gilbert Wu's quest to become a ruler quickly came to an end when he met the connector. We see Gilbert's right-hand man surprised by this turn of events and questioning who the connector even is. In chapter 183 of Kengan Omega, Gilbert and Edward are basically the same person, so their characteristics will be very similar to each other. And so Edward isn't just some prideful king, but rather a prideful weapon or servant. This should come as no surprise, as the Wu clan, no matter how powerful they are, have always played that role and usually come to have a similar relationship to partners or servants as time goes on, as if by destiny. Now that we understand the character of Edward Wu a bit more, it's time to talk about his inevitable fall and his death. "You were too strong, that's why you lost." This quote is probably the most infamous in the Kengan community for its memeable nature, but also the absurdity of it. To completely understand these words, however, we must go to the beginning of Edward's fall, and that should bring us a lot more clarity on those words. The beginning of Edward's fall starts in chapter 57, when instead of participating in the Purgatory vs Kengan tournament, he lets his spare Alan Wu participate for him instead. Edward, just by looking at Ryan once, was able to gauge just how powerful he was, and admits that he was naive for making that decision. But that's not the complete reason, as will become evident. Ryan eventually catches up to Edward and gets beaten by him. However, Edward doesn't kill Ryan then and there, with Enryu and Xing eventually catching up to him as well. The brawl among the Wu clan continues and Edward has multiple chances to kill the people who are fighting against him. But even when he beats them down, he doesn't finish them off himself. While Edward chooses not to kill the Wu clan and the Kure members fighting against him, his forces are taken out one by one. Edward, even seeing this, does not lose his cool and is still confident in his own victory. It's important to note that Edward does not use any techniques for most of this fight if we exclude Gohan, just like Ryan did back in the day with his removal in Kengan Ashra. But towards the end of the fight, he does use one technique. However, at that point, it's too late. Here we can see a repeating cycle, and that is Edward isn't taking his opponents seriously. And the reason why is simple, because Edward is stronger than them. In my fate analysis, I talk about how great power could be used against itself. But great power can also create a false sense of security. Edward was strong enough to defeat the Wu clan and the Kure at any point he wanted by himself. As I mentioned earlier, Edward is good at gauging power, so he could probably tell that he was the strongest and that he didn't have to worry. This is probably why he doesn't finish Ryan off and belittles Enryu and Xing, and that's because he can afford to do that. In fact, this is a similar reason as to why Ryan didn't use any techniques against Oma in Kengan Ashra. Ryan could afford to hold back in that way as he was never challenged enough by anyone before that. Ryan's pride in that fight gave Oma the time to access his potential, and because of this, Oma eventually wins. Edward did the same with the Wu Clan alliance, but also Ryan. Enryu is able to catch on to Edward's weakness and uses it against him by unleashing Ryan's potential with his own death. Edward and Ryan are like a mirror image of each other, or to put it more specifically, Edward Wu is Ryan's prideful and inevitable future if he hadn't learned from his battle with Oma. Edward Wu, with his pride and immense power, was unable to see the threat posed to him because of his own power, ultimately blinding him to the inevitable fate of his defeat and death. Edward never stood a chance because he kept on deliberately letting the chances go. In conclusion, Edward's fate was determined by himself. He had every opportunity up until Ryan awakened his potential to win. However, Edward's power blinded him from seeing his defeat before it was too late. Like watching a bomb tick down to 0 only to realize you are not bomb-proof. Edward was too strong for his own good, leading him to prideful ignorance and overconfidence. A famous quote from the book of Proverbs says the following: "Pride comes before the fall, and boy was it a fall." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and sub if you liked the video, and tell me your thoughts on Edward Wu and whether or not you agree or disagree in the comment section, of course. But until next time, take it easy.